we're back with another episode of On the Record with Tiffany. Um, I love having people on my show just to talk about who they are and what they do, how they contribute to what we know to be the history of San Antonio, the history of San Antonio within Texas, and the history of Texas within the United States. It's just always been something of interest to me. So today, I have my good friend Greg on, and he is a well-known historian within the Texas community. Um, Greg, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Hey Tiffany, how have you been, ma'am?
I'm good. I'm good.
It's
It's
great
been a
to see
while
you
since I've
again.
gotten to see you.
I know some unexpected changes, but one more chapter done, and let's start the next one. So that's how I kind of look at it.
So
How
tell
and why? Why am I doing this? How did I get started? Um, History has always kind of been my thing. I've enjoyed it all through school, high school, and all that kind of stuff. Some of my favorite teachers were history teachers. My dad was a huge history buff. He was a metal detector, so he metal detected his whole life. So he was always reading where old forts were and old market roads and just mapping out different places where he might get to go and metal detect in Texas and what was going on in a particular time. So my brain was always kind of geared towards doing those things. When I got out of high school, I went into the restaurant business. I did restaurants and kitchens for 17 years.
wow.
Yeah, uh, loved every minute of it. The community of the kitchens, I wouldn't trade that in for a thing. The pressure and the work of the kitchens, I don't miss a bit. But the people that I worked with in those kitchens, I met such a diverse crew of people, man, from the bottom of the barrel to really top-notch people and everyone in between, from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, from different cultures, different foods presented to me in a kitchen. So that really, I ended that after my dad passed away and my brother re-upped for Iraq at 40 years old. So I moved back to Castroville, Texas to stay with my mom to help her out. Started going to UTSA, got my bachelor's, and I got on with the Institute of Texan Cultures, the museum, the cultural museum that UTSA runs. Worked there about a year, and I started working on my master's, got my master's knocked out, got brought on full-time about the time I finished my master's. And I was lucky enough to have a department head named Lupita Barrera, who really mentored me in um, the joy of research and the joy of learning people's story, the joy of telling a person's story that hasn't been told before, and not only the feeling you get telling it, but the feeling they get that it's now being told. Um, that that right there is one of the main reasons I've gotten into this research into Negro League Baseball. And my research didn't start at a national level. I didn't start with these guys that are in the airport exhibit, like Rube Foster and Willie Wells. And well, I knew who Willie was because I was from Austin, and that was one of the first Negro Leaguers that my dad ever talked about was Willie Wells. My dad got me into baseball. My dad was a passionate baseball man. He had me reading books on hitting, and we had the baseball encyclopedia around. And he's the first man that ever exposed me to the Negro Leagues. Um, but we I've gotten to a point. I've done it. I did the national stuff is there. Everybody's told the national story. Rube Foster, Willie, Biz Mackey, all of those cats that are in the Hall of Fame, their story has been told. I represented it in the exhibit we did together out at the airport, but the part of that exhibit that is closest to my heart is the local stuff, the San Antonio Black Sox stuff, the East
Black
Side
Aces.
colored baseball. Go ahead, Tiff. I'm sorry.
The Black Aces, right?
Yeah, yeah. See,
That's what I
San,
loved about the exhibit and about what you did there was instead of just going with all of the names that everybody knows, like Jackie Robinson, you were like, let's look at people that had a huge influence, but that you you don't know, that the average person does not know.
And when we got Mule in on that, on that exhibit, he's a perfect example of that, because Mule probably mentored more young black baseball players in this area, and
Tell our,
was
tell our audience who Mule is.
John Mule Miles. He is a local celebrity in San Antonio. He does actually hold the Major League record, even though Major League doesn't recognize Negro League records, for consecutive games with a home run, with 11 straight games where he hit a home run. Nobody's even come close to that. And we're talking Reggie Jackson, Mickey Mantle, Babe Ruth, all of the greats. Nobody's come close to touching that.
Wow.
But unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to personally meet Mr. Miles. About the time I was getting into this, I missed both him and a gentleman named Cleveland Grant by about 6 months to a year. And from all the people that I've spoken to, those two men specifically were as important to the black baseball community in San Antonio as anybody I've heard spoken of before or since. I think Mule probably topped that list. And it was so awesome to finally get a chance to talk to Kenneth, because I knew that Dick O'Neill, the white gentleman that played in the Negro Leagues that was on Deborah's Collins show, him and Kenneth, I didn't realize him and Kenneth were such great friends, because I knew that Dick and John Mule were once they met, they were like, man, you couldn't get rid of them. They were buds.
You couldn't separate them.
Yeah, because they both went through kind of the same experience, because Mule was the first black player to play in the South Texas leagues, baseball leagues. And Dick O'Neill was one of the only white men to ever play professionally in the Negro leagues. So Dick told me one time when they asked Mule a question, they said, how did it feel to be the only black man on a white team? They asked Dick, how did it feel to be the only white man on a black team? And they both had nearly word for word exact same answers. And ever since that day, they were just best buddies. You know, they understood each other's experience at that point. But that's the kind of person that, from what I've heard, that Mule was. You know, he was there to tell the story. And when things started happening in the mid to late 90s with Negro Leagues really beginning to get a lot more attention, he was so happy. Like, hey, you know, Buck O'Neill is so happy right now, or was so happy as things began to really pick up momentum, especially into the 2000s. Every time you see Buck O'Neill,
what caused everybody to start paying attention to the Negro Leagues in the mid-90s?
There was a few scholars out there that really started doing some hard research. I can't off the top of my head. He's got the Negro League Baseball Encyclopedia. He wrote that. And then there was another gentleman that wrote Only the Ball Was White. And I can't recall their names off the top of my head right now. But they really began a movement in the late 80s and early 90s to where researchers started getting into it. And when researchers start putting information out there, you know, facts, that's what we do, is we present our facts and we make a case for history. And once you begin to make a case for history that inevitably can't be denied, then the story is going to get feed at some point. And I think, you know, the development of the cable networks, the development of social media through the 2000s, I think all of that played a big part, because social media can do a lot of good things if used correctly. You know, if used incorrectly, it can do a lot of bad things, but there's good ways to use it. And I think that was a big part through the 2000s of how the story really began to get out there. And you started to see a lot more scholars paying attention. And it's like you said, you know, this history just that wasn't being told or was being covered, or whatever reason it wasn't getting out there, was beginning to get out there. And, you know, basically the dam breaks. You know, you can only hold the water back so long, and the dam breaks. So that's what happened.
Greg, I have to say, I'm thankful to people like you who are keeping up with Black history, because if it weren't for your love for baseball, just unabiding, I mean, anybody that's listening can hear your unabiding love for the game and for the players of the game, if it weren't for that, um, we wouldn't have such great history about Negro League baseball players.
You can thank me, Tiffany, but I think the big thanks goes to when I started to sit down with guys like Joe Lewis and Raymond Hardy and Marion Shaw and
But you went and
Kerrville.
met people, right?
Yeah, I put
Because
a
you
face
loved
to
it
the
so much, you went to go
I put a face
and
to the
meet them.
history. And how do you hate someone when you know their story?
That's
How
right.
do you do that? You may not
Right.
you may not like them, but once you know a person's story and what they've been through and what they deserve, part of their stories deserve to be told, it's pretty hard to hate a person.
That's
You
right.
can disagree on as many points of contact as you want to disagree on, but if you've taken the time to listen to a person's story, actually listen to them, genuinely listen to them, it's really hard to hate that person. And I
Well,
think that's where it started for me.
now for my listeners, I just want you to come back and listen to Greg Garrett. Greg Garrett is one of the best historians for uh, baseball and for the Negro Baseball League and the Negro Baseball experience. And Greg is not African American, he's actually Caucasian. And he is an example of what today we need to pay more attention to, and that's our fellow man, and stop looking at the things that make us different, but start looking at the things that unite us, and that we're alike around, and baseball is one of them. So if you want to hear more about players that you've never heard of and that had a huge influence on the San Antonio community, then come on back and listen to Greg Garrett as he tells you about the Negro Baseball League. And you're listening to On the Record with Tiffany. And we're back with Greg Garrett, a Texas historian who's telling us a little bit about the Negro Baseball League. We Texas Kidney Foundation and SACAM did, along with the Museum of Texan Cultures, we did an exhibit, and Greg was the lead on the exhibit for the Museum of Texan Cultures, and he just really did a bang up job on the Negro Baseball League. And, you know, I didn't know Greg. This is my first time meeting him and kind of getting to know more about the Negro Baseball League. And Greg is just a wealth of knowledge on the players and on what actually transpired during uh, those years of segregated baseball. Greg, can
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I was listening to you. Zoning out a little bit.
can you tell our audience a little bit more about, in the last segment you were talking about um, just why you ended up getting into this, but tell them about your interviews with the players, because you actually went out and met the players from the Negro Baseball League
Yes, I
here in
did.
Texas, the Texas.
Well, yeah, so some of them. I got a chance to meet several of them. I've worked with a group of guys from San Antonio that told me the San Antonio story. And I also worked with it. This is when Invisible Diamonds first got off the ground back in 2015.
Invisible
Um,
Diamond is the name the of the exhibit that Greg created for SACAM and Texas Kidney Foundation and University and Museum of Texan Cultures.
yeah, we started it back in 2015. We had a couple of programs at the museum. The first one that we did, I presented, and we had a couple of the fellas at that one, I believe. But the second one that we did was later in the summertime, and we were actually able to get Dr. Damian Thomas from the Smithsonian African American Museum. He was the sports curator there.
Wow.
We were also able to get Dr. Revelle, who was the head of the Center for Negro League Baseball Research, up in on the other side of Dallas. It's up in North Texas somewhere. And then we also had several players that were still alive that sat on a panel and answered some questions from Dr. Revelle, and then answered some questions from the audience. And in that group of guys, I had players that played in San Antonio proper as early as the 1920s. A.D. Carpenter, I think when I spoke to him, he was 96 years old. He died a couple of years later. And Roy White, who we wanted to try to get into the exhibit, but we just couldn't get enough solid information. And Mr. White passed away, and we couldn't get a hold of any family members. And I'm of the ilk that I would rather not put it in if I'm not going to be sure about it. I like to be sure about my research.
Yeah.
So, and Roy was pushing 85, 86, and he had
really
played.
To hear the information from him, not from a second source, secondary.
Exactly.
Source.
So, and then I worked with the guys in San Antonio proper, and this was a bunch of fellows from the Black Sox, Everett Turner and Dittany Johnson, and then we had Joseph Vaughns, who played with the San Antonio Indians, and these guys were all playing over at out near Wheatley Heights, out in that area, right across from the MLK Academy at Brooksdale and MLK. There was an old baseball field there. And a couple blocks down in the Wheatley Heights neighborhood is where the Wheatley Heights All-Stars played. There was another field down there. So this was like a whole little community. And then about 6 miles away, you had Lincoln Park, where the Lincoln Park Athletics were playing. So you had this whole little community going on in San Antonio that, part of the backbone of it was black baseball. And that story needed to be told. It's still being told. We're still working on finding where all the fields were. I'd like to get historical markers put at some of these fields. I just worked with Vince from San Antonio Express News. We did an article, and I took them around and showed them a couple of spots where the fields were, and that my goal is to someday have markers representing where these men played and the story that needs to be told there. Especially at Lincoln Park, because now you've got the big, huge community center, the Eastside Community Center over there. You've got several baseball fields where the kids are playing ball. So if there's a legacy still around San Antonio that was started by black baseball, Lincoln Park is where it's at, in my opinion. Now, as far as the rural story, I was able, through a good friend of mine, Clifton Pfeiffer, who I had worked with as an interpreter, a historical interpreter. He was from Kerrville. He began to introduce me to the Kerrville All-Stars that were still alive. This is Raymond Red Hardy and Joe Lewis and Marion Shaw and Alan Hicks. And so I began to put a face, to this history. And it became personal to me,
I have a question. So who watched the games? We know that the leagues were segregated, but were the games segregated?
In Kerrville, no.
Yeah, like the people who were watching the games.
Look, it was Kerrville. The stands were integrated. People were coming to watch baseball. I mean, but if you even think back to between 1910 and 1920, before Rube Foster got the Negro National League off the ground, Rube Foster was touring the United States, and probably, other than Joe Lewis, was most well-known African-American person in the United States. He had the largest black enterprise next to, it was a makeup industry in the 1920s, was the only larger black enterprise than baseball. And it wasn't just black people going to those games. Wherever they were in the Rube Foster figured out a way to travel through the South successfully during Jim Crow, during segregation, and still white people were filling the stands as much as black people were in the South in the 1910s. This was happening in San Antonio too. Maybe not quite as much in the urban area as quickly as it was happening in Kerrville, because in Kerrville, they told me, man, in the 40s, you look up in the stands and people were just watching baseball. Mm-hmm. And I talked to them about, so the stands were integrated, but you couldn't go down and sit at the restaurant and eat inside. He said, we didn't need to do that. We'd ask one of them to go get food for us. They'd bring the food down to us. They'd ask one of the white folks in the stand to go get the food for them, and they'd bring the food down to them at the ballpark. to keep them from even having to worry about the hassle of the restaurant. But that team in Kerrville, they were breaking a lot of historical barriers, in my opinion, way before the town desegregated, because that didn't happen until 63, if I'm not mistaken. It was a forced desegregation of the schools. And they were already integrating the baseball team. The Kerrville All-Stars were already integrating before Brown versus Board of Education. Bill, oh man, I can't think his last name off the top of my head, and they're gonna kill me when I can't remember it. He managed them, and he was a real important figure in both San Antonio and in Kerrville. He came from the East Coast, and his last name will pop into my head here in a minute. But he managed the team. He didn't care what color you were. He wanted to win games. So there was one old boy, white boy, that lived in Kerrville that pitched, and he could throw, and I can't remember his name without looking at my research. I want to say Tommy McDaniels, but don't quote me on that. He went on to become the police chief of Kerrville. He pitched for the Kerrville All-Stars on a regular basis, and this was in the mid-50s. You know, they were bringing Mexican guys in to play on that team that lived in Kerrville. They would go and scrimmage against some of the high school team, the high school team, the white high school team.
So the teams were desegregating in baseball before the schools and the cities were.
And that was, even in San Antonio, you saw, I mean, and it didn't happen. I'm not going to say that every game there was white folks and black folks playing together. I'm not going to say that. But the ice was beginning to thaw, and there was beginning to be cracks, and you were beginning to see.
Sports was at the forefront of that. Yes. Baseball was at the forefront.
I think the military and sports have played a huge role in breaking down a lot of those barriers, because
it allowed sports.
Yeah, and it allowed an individual to prove themselves in a way that they hadn't had an opportunity to prove themselves. And Rube Foster was very aware of not only how we perform on the field, but how we perform off the field means just as much. He understood that. And what was amazing about Rube Foster is you had the American League president at the time, Van Johnson, and you also had John McGraw, who I believe was the general manager for the New York Giants baseball team. They treated Rube Foster, these were both white men, they treated Rube Foster as a baseball equal. Color had nothing to do with their relationship. Between the three of those men, I think they were a lot closer to integrating baseball before 1920 than a lot of people give them credit for. Now, Tennessee Mountain Landis, Judge Landis came along, and whether or not he was a stout racist, he projected that, and that was because he was doing the owner's work, and there were several stout racists in ownership of baseball at that time. So once Landis became the commissioner of baseball, everything got pretty shut down as far as the progress Van Johnson and John McGraw had made. That's just my historical opinion. There may be others that differ with that, but from what I've looked at and what I've read and the attitudes that people had toward what Rube Foster was trying to do, I really feel they were a lot closer than even Rube may have thought they were.
You know, Greg, a lot of what we're seeing today, we can look back at baseball's history and learn from. You know, some of the things that there's more that makes us, that unites us than divides us. We are more alike than we are different. And that's what baseball continuously teaches us, that performance, camaraderie, seeing your fellow man for who they are is more important than what they are.
But it also gave those African American men the opportunity to put themselves onto a pedestal that they had not been able to put themselves onto before. So think of the confidence that it put into them, the self-confidence. You know, think of the way they began to look at themselves when they became financially independent. You
Mm.
know, that they didn't have to worry about, you know, what am I going to do for a doctor? When people began to respect who they were as a human being because they were a baseball player.
And
Those are
there's something
things that
about winning. There's something about playing, doing
absolutely.
your very best, and winning and achieving that cannot be taken away from you.
And if you know baseball, then you know whether or not a person can play.
Hmm.
And if you love baseball, then you really don't care what they look like. You just love the fact that they can play.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so,
Sports kind of bring that out. Period. Baseball, football, basketball. There's
yep.
something about athletics and the competition that goes on there, and just seeing someone performing at their very level best that just elicits respect
And
from
that's,
both sides.
I think the more I've learned about Rube and the man he was, I think he's probably, I would put him right there with Branch Rickey as having been one of the baseball minds that's done the most to move baseball forward since its establishment as a professional sport in the 1860s with the Cincinnati Reds starting off as the first baseball team. I don't think that Rube gets enough credit for how far he moved the sport forward. And I think you can see how important he was. A, he put so much of his heart and his soul into it, it drove him crazy. He died in an insane asylum. And he, in 27 or 28, is about the time he had to go in. I'd have to go and look at the date. I know it was the mid to late 20s. He went into the insane asylum, and almost immediately you begin to see the league fracture again. So even with people like C.I. Taylor still around, even with people like, you know, Cumberland Posey running the Homestead Grays, Effa Manley at you know, a female owner, black female owner of a baseball team, Effa Manley, the Newark Eagles. Even with
Wow.
these great minds, yeah, she's in the Hall of Fame. Even with these great minds around, the league still fractured, and it was never really the same. I mean, it still provided a platform where you learned men like Josh Gibson and Satchel, and you learned all these names that came along, and it produced Jackie and Monty Irvin and all of these cats. But when Rube disappeared from the mix, it was never that centrifugal force that was driving everything. He
Hmm.
was just the engine behind it, and everybody understood that. And you may not have liked his tactics at times, and you may not have liked his orneriness and his hard-headedness, but you knew he believed in his people, his community, his sport, and his players. And that's all they needed. And that's how he got that off the ground. And when you're that genuine about something, I think that's helped me even in my research and going out and being able to walk up to total strangers, and by the end of a conversation have them trustworthy enough to begin to share important moments in their lives with me.
Hmm.
You know, especially someone, you know, who's this white boy walking into the neighborhood all of a sudden, coming and knocking on the door and asking about baseball. You know, and
Hmm.
a couple of them tested me to see if I was serious or not. And once they realized the passion I had and how important I knew their story was to get out there, um,
And how
then
committed you were to making sure that the story was accurate.
yes. Well, and now at that point it's become personal, and it's something that I'm attached to emotionally. It's part of who I am, and it's something I'll never stop doing at this point. Is promoting that story because, like I said, the national story is there, but there's so many nooks and crannies to the local story, the local town teams. I don't know if you had a chance to watch the deal we did with SACAM right after we had the exhibit, but one direction I would really like to start going, if there's a way I could find either plantation journals or slave journals of some form, because I believe buffalo soldiers and freedmen colonies were kind of the spring that
Beginning.
starts the, yeah, the spring that started the river. You
Mm-hmm.
know, that top of the river, that small trickle that turns into something that
Mm-hmm.
feeds into the Gulf of Mexico. I think that they had a major, Buffalo Soldiers especially, because I think the military had a major role in spreading baseball throughout the country and to these different communities. But I would love to be able to, even if it's outside of Texas, is to be able to find some slave journals or some plantation journals that talked about the slaves playing games. It's really hard for me to believe that during the Civil War in the South, as much ball that was played during downtime, both by Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
that there weren't slaves around seeing these boys playing this ball at some point or time. Every culture has a stick and ball game in their culture. So
And that's an
even if they weren't,
interesting idea. I hadn't even thought about that.
well,
I wondered,
the
were they doing that?
yes, well, the reason that it kind of got legs in my brain is I was doing some research, and I went to high school in Lockhart. I graduated from Lockhart, Texas. Go Lions. Um, and I had a lot of very close friends that were from St. John Colony. They went to school in Lockhart, which
Mm-hmm.
is a freedman colony, one of the oldest ones in Texas, actually. And I started doing some research, and boom, St. John Colony had a baseball team. Now, this was early 1900s. I don't know how far back this went, but that's what, second generation, third generation freedmen, and they
Mm-hmm.
got a baseball team, organized baseball team. And I started digging a little bit more, and there was another little freedman colony called Ebon, Ebon, near Lockhart also. And I found one sentence that said, I think it might have been even St. John's played the Ebon colony team or the Ebon team. So I found these real brief descriptions of these established freedmen colonies having baseball teams. So I'm like, well, geez, how far does that go back? You know,
Yeah.
so you start thinking,
Like in historical terms, like, huh,
and
that couldn't have just popped up.
no, well, I've taken it back in San Antonio. I've got it back to the earliest like article I can find was about is very early 1880s, and it actually mentions Juneteenth celebration out at San Pedro Park, and they were going to be giving away blue ribbons for everybody that won their contests. One of the contests they were going to be giving away for was a baseball contest. So that tells me there was multiple teams. All right, if they're going to be having a baseball contest, they got to have play against each other. You know, there's got to be two teams at least, probably more. I got to believe this isn't the first day they just all of a sudden gathered up 18 guys, found them ball gloves, found them bats, found them baseball, and said, hey, we're going to go out here and play this brand new game for you guys. And we're going to give you a blue ribbon for it. This, you got to read between the lines with this research because it just wasn't reported on. So
Mm-hmm.
that tells me that they were organized prior to that day, obviously, organized enough to have multiple teams, enough players on each team to field a team, organized into teams, separate teams. So if they knew that they were going to come to the park and play then, they'd probably already been playing against each other prior to that. So that tells me there was probably some sort of an organized league prior to that 1882, 1883 or whatever. So reading between the lines, you know, mid 1870s, black baseball is already a part of San Antonio culture. And I think it goes further back than that. But it just really strikes me as hard to believe that slaves had access to plantation spots. Certain slaves had access. You know, pretty much there was a slave in every point on plantation doing something. It's really hard for me to believe there's baseball being played on the plantation that slaves didn't see it. It is very hard for me to believe that and not comprehend what was going on, be able to digest it, take it back to their little slave community down at the bottom of the plantation and get their own ball game going. I think it's plausible.
And you may be right because how did the teams just all of a sudden pop up
That's
Directly
exactly.
after slavery.
There's yes. So there's a lot more to the story, you know. I mean, like I said, that national story, I think it's been covered pretty solidly. I
Mm.
wanted to do it because I wanted us to focus on those 8 Texas guys that played such a big role in that National Negro League since it was the 100-year anniversary. But for me, the real story is right there what we're talking about. Getting down and dirty and finding out, all right, how far back does this thing go? Does it go back as far as the 1850s, 1840s, when baseball was really starting to take off in the nation as a whole, and it had
Mm-hmm.
pretty much reached Texas? Because I think baseball got to Texas during the 1840s when we were fighting the Mexican-American War in the 1848 during that period of time. I think the military brought it here. That's my hypothesis. I've found a few things that back that, and I think that at some point that's another big research project for me.
It's the
But yeah,
military and the military.
there's so many rabbit holes to get down that just haven't been covered yet. You know.
So let's bring it forward a little bit and talk about this being the 100th year anniversary of the Negro Baseball Leagues. This is such
Well,
a historic year. I mean, we've got a pandemic going on. We've
gosh,
got it's the 100th year anniversary
2020.
of women's suffrage. We've got social uprising. So what do you think from your historical perspective? How do you see baseball's history as being able to speak to today, to what's
Well,
happening today?
the first thing I want to say is it breaks my heart because going into this year, man, so many different groups and organizations, Major League Baseball, the Negro League Museum in Kansas City, Cooperstown, you know, all of the radio stations that are the TV stations that carry their local baseball games, their regional baseball games. This was going to be the year that every single baseball game, there was going to be a point that the announcers were going to talk about the 100-year anniversary.
Mm,
Every single game. I don't care if it's your local broadcast. I don't care if it's ESPN broadcast, Fox Sports broadcast, the ABC broadcast on Saturday. I don't care what it was. They were going to get their spotlight. And bam, 2020 has happened.
mm.
Glorious 2020. But
Coronavirus.
my Lord, it's definitely going to go down in the history books.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that story, uh, gosh, if it's not relevant today, when is it relevant? You
Mm-hmm.
know, I think it's as relevant today as the day they sat there and they founded it and voted on it that night and woke up the next morning and the National Negro League was founded. I think they're the trials and the tribulations that were faced getting to that point are some of the same trials and tribulations that we are facing today. And
Mm-hmm.
I think at times, whatever side you stand on, I think at times, and probably more often than not, we forget to take a step back and with an apolitical eye, because I think that when you're talking about history at times, and this is how kind of I approach my research, is I try to do it with an apolitical eye because I'm of the ilk that I feel you have to let the facts and the research determine and shape the narrative and the conclusion. If you
Right. Let the
go
facts speak for themselves. Don't
exactly,
you don't need to add something to it.
if you go into research with a conclusion and a narrative that is fitting what your political or personal or religious or social beliefs are, then you are making yourself vulnerable to the trap that I feel a lot of historians fall into, and that is shaping the facts that they gather to fit into that preconceived narrative that they went into their research with. Am I making sense on that?
Yes.
So I feel strongly about trying professionally as a historian, because I think that's what it takes, is trying to stay apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays, if people on both sides of the aisle, I don't care, R or D, I don't care what you are, need to take a step back and genuinely read the history books and read them with an apolitical mind so that they can understand the situation, and it isn't in a 2020 vacuum that they're looking at it. You can't look at history through a 2020 lens. It's not fair to the people who created the history, and it's not fair to the community that's listening to you today, because I think it distorts it for both groups. You have to look at it through the lens of the people who experienced it and understand the exact experience they went through in order that that experience does not get repeated.
You know, the
And
best thing to your point, the best thing that we can do is put ourselves in the other person's shoes and try to
absolutely,
get a perspective of why is this individual reacting or behaving in this way, or why is the meaning so intense for this person. I need to
yeah.
understand that,
You
you
know,
know.
Miss Tiff, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier when you're asking me a couple questions, and I said it's all about learning a person's story,
Hmm.
putting yourself in their shoes. Once you take the time to genuinely learn a person's story, I feel like you've done as much as you can to put yourself in their shoes.
And
You
it's
know,
hard to hate somebody
when
when you have truly put yourself in their position. When you've
and
truly subjugated yourself to, okay, this is what's going on here.
and I think that the the difference between hate and disagreement has been very clouded
Hmm.
the last decade or so. You know, I just feel like things are,
You know,
and
we
I hate
started
to
with
keep,
this whole digging in and taking sides with news and with politics. I believe in the news we would call it sensationalization uh, 20 years ago, but it's still the same thing where you take one take up one gauntlet on one side.
yep,
And it really shouldn't be that way because news is supposed to be the facts just represented, and then we get to make a determination. The public makes a determination as to what those facts are, or in you know whatever authority group or figure it makes the decision on what that is, or the individual does,
yep,
but it's
absolutely.
not supposed to be in any way driven or influenced by the purveyor of the story, by the media or by the people that are telling the story. We're not actually supposed to be influencing that.
And you know, I'll be honest, I still have a whole lot of faith in human nature and the human spirit, and I honestly feel that the loudest voices are those ones that want to project that those differences, that want to project us, you know, being at each other's throats. I really honestly believe the majority of us want to look for those similarities. It's just those
Hmm.
other loud voices drown us out, you know? The majority of us just want to go about our daily lives, get along with our neighbors, sit on the front porch, pay our bills, take care of our families, you know, just lead a life.
Right.
And
And and lead a life where it's okay to have a differing opinion, but
yes,
nobody's going to come for you because you have
yeah,
a different opinion.
exactly. We've gotten to a point where we can't disagree civilly.
Hmm.
And that's probably one of the scariest things in my opinion that's happened, because I'm the type of person that I love talking to people. You know, I
Right.
love having
You know,
discourse.
the important thing about human beings is that you know, I say this all the time, we're more alike than we are different. And if you want to be heard, then you have to be at every table. So
Yep,
you can't have a Democratic Party with no black people. You can't have a Republican Party with no black people. You
yep,
can't have an independent party with no Hispanic people, no Black people, no uh, people of different ethnic backgrounds have to be in every party. They have to be in every group. So that that means more than each party has to go and invite some people in. That means that we have to take the initiative and go and join groups that maybe that's not what you would necessarily do, or maybe you don't believe in every piece of that ideology, but you believe that you have something to say
and
and that you can help that group learn more about your group. You have to be
that's
there.
that's I 100% agree with you on that. You know, that's a standard I've tried to lead, you know, or that I've tried to project
Hmm.
to the people around me, and hopefully,
And your
you know,
life
even if
really is a good example of that, because here you are studying history, and there's a plethora of history for you to study. There's so many things for you to study. I'm sure Negro baseball is not the only love that you have in terms of history, but you chose a history that wouldn't readily have been a part of your life in terms of the Negro Baseball League. It was because you loved baseball,
yeah,
but it was a history that wasn't necessarily your own, in the sense that you weren't just learning everything about Negro baseball, uh, just sitting around at the table. But
yes,
now all of a sudden, you entering into that scene changes things up, not just for you, but for the people that you're interacting with too.
oh yeah, yeah. Uh, the 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 friendships that I have made, you know, some of these men have passed away that have been very close to me, and their wives call me and they tell me, and they invite me to the funeral, and like Joe Louis, I mean, they had me as because I helped him get his signatures in the in Birmingham Negro League Museum that talks about the Southern Leagues. Him and Raymond and a few of them, they've got signed balls in that museum. You know, there's a legacy there, and I didn't realize. I mean, I knew he's appreciative, but when you're sitting at his funeral and his wife is saying thank you to you, you know, in front of everybody, in front of the entire congregation, they're saying, we want to thank Greg Garrett for the things he's done and the story he's been able to help Joe tell. And the same with Travis Lefty Vaughn's, you know, his wife the same way. And she told me when she called me to let me know he had passed that she wanted me to be sure I understood how much he enjoyed the time me and him were able to spend together. And when I make connections like that to where it goes beyond being my professional historian career, it goes beyond the research, it goes beyond Negro League Baseball, it's become a friendship now. You know, it's become somebody I care about.
And you're breaking down barriers.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
that's when we aspire to be better, then we have to step out of our comfort zone. And you can be better if you do better. So instead of just sitting behind a stack of books, you opted to get up, go out, and find the people that you were studying.
They deserved it. They motivated me to do that. You know, why should it just be a name on a page?
Hmm.
Let me talk about my friends, not just a name on a page. Now I'm talking about my friends. So that carries that much more weight, you
You know,
know?
anybody that talks to you can see history coming alive when you're talking about it, because you're so excited about the Negro Baseball League. It, you know, you put so much into the Black Diamond exhibit. You know, that exhibit, I didn't know what it was going to be like. I'm not a historian.
Yeah.
I basically, the way that I got involved with it is that I wanted to do something special for um, for the doctors that I work with, because they have one of them in particular, Dr. Kumar Sharma. He's really a smart guy, and he discovered a diabetic pathway this year, and I thought I believe he's going to win a Nobel Prize one day. I tell him that all the time because he's doing great work for kidney disease. So I said I want to do something special that he's never seen before. So let's make an exhibit. But I wanted it to be called Barrier Breakers.
Yeah,
And
we talked about that up at the exhibit.
that's
Yes.
right. I
Yeah.
wanted it to be called Barrier Breakers. And uh, we couldn't get the barrier breakers off the ground, so we ended up with black invisible diamond. And I thought when I saw it and started thinking about it, I thought, man, this is so apropos for the doctors that I work with because they are, for the most part, invisible to the public. Like
Yeah.
most people have no idea what they're
Behind the
what they're
scenes,
doing. Yeah, they're
doing the
they're
hard
just
research. Yeah.
they're just
Boots on the
doing.
ground. Yeah.
Yeah, they're just out there working, you know, saving people from coronavirus and like doing all this
Exactly.
stuff,
Yeah. The unsung
and
ones,
then like
man.
taking these little meetings with me at night. Hey, how you doing?
The unsung heroes. They're the ones that keep this country going, man. Is those
Like
unsung heroes.
yeah, like he's doing all this great stuff, and so are some of the other ones, Dr. Figueroa. We've just got some really good docs that are doing major work for kidney disease, and we're seeing breakthroughs starting to happen, and I thought this is perfect because this describes who they are, that and it shows that history does um, teach us something. And it teaches us about camaraderie. It teaches us how to work together because we're in the medical field. A lot of the great discoveries that are being made right now, it's being made by a team. There are teams of people working together. Projects like the Kidney Precision Medicine Project. There are teams working in tandem, and each moving part is playing their role. And so when you created that exhibit, and I finally got to see it, I was elated. I was just elated by
Well,
it
I'm glad. I'm
because
really glad. I'm glad it all worked. Like I said, I don't know where I'd be right now at this point without you and Saycam and Deborah. And they, like I said, the way y'all took this project and ran with it. And I've been just banging my head against the wall trying to get someone to run with it for the last 4 or 5 years. And now I know it's in good, safe hands with Saycam.
now listen, audience, you know, that kind of what Greg just said, people doing what Greg does, Greg worked on that for years before we picked it up. Years. So that wasn't something that was just thrown together. That was 5 years of his life and interviews and toil and sweat to bring the stories of those of this group of Negro Baseball League players to light. Uh, it's not preserving history is a very important part of the American experience, and unfortunately, as soon as things get tough, the first thing we cut is history, as
Yeah.
we saw here recently with the Museum of Texan Cultures. Um, and that's a shame. It's a shame because history,
It is. It's unfortunate. I
if
agree
we,
with that.
something that you said earlier, Greg, that I think bears repeating is if we do not study our history, what happens?
it repeats. I mean,
That's
I
right.
just and when you study it, you can't put 2020 lenses on it. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
can't take it in the same syntax as and put it into what's going on around us. I mean, you've got to learn what portions of that are similar to the fights and the toils and the things that we're facing today, and how can what we learned then be used now instead of just relearning it again or trying to
How can we
relearn it
make
again.
life better now
Exactly.
and not
And
repeat the same nonsense we've done
and
in the past?
I know we keep talking about the players and players and stuff. I want to be sure to get out there that the community, the African American community, was
Mm-hmm.
just as important for Black baseball as the players were, the guys that actually got out there on that field. You know, kind of like what we talked about with Kerrville a little bit ago. But
Mm-hmm.
even before then, you know, baseball, with it being the Sunday in the most African American communities, especially the ones that I've been into and I've talked to them about what was it like in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s. You know, it was church, baseball.
Right.
Then once you're done with baseball, go get a quick shower, and then you're gonna take your girl down to the juke joint. We're gonna dance for a while, maybe have a couple of beverages, and we're just gonna have some good fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that was their Sundays to a T. And the whole community was a part of that. Barbecuing at the park, singing in between when they're switching in between home and visitor, going on the field and off the field, standing up and dancing and singing in the stand. Sometimes it would flow out into the field. They'd start dancing in the field, you know? So
Mm-hmm.
this was a community event. Um, this was a moment where the community was allowed self-determination, where the community was allowed to make the most of opportunity, you know,
Mm-hmm.
where the community was given the opportunity to really start to build community pride in something, you know, really be proud of these Kerrville guys that are going out and kicking these dudes' butts in Del Rio, going to Hondo and kicking their butts, you know. We're proud of these guys. It gave them something that they could all just rally behind. And they needed that at that time. That was important to that community at that time. And to have that much of a response from the community was important to those guys on the field. And that's why I really have tried to focus on the local scene, because even these dudes that are in the Cooperstown, you know, Rube and all these guys, they all started on a small town team.
Mm-hmm.
Every single one of them. They all started in Giddings, Seguin, LaGrange, you know, wherever it may have been. They all started on that local town team. I don't care how big a name they ended up and how big a star they ended up. That's where they started. So that was the root of it, in my opinion. And that's where that's something that the community nurtured. You know, that took a community to do that. So we can talk a lot about the players, but the community was just as important to establishing Black baseball in Texas as those players and those guys with the talent to get out there and swing the bat and catch the ball and run the bases as they were to building the game.
And I just want my listeners, Greg Garrett, thank you so much for
Tip,
spending your
my
time
absolute
with
pleasure.
me and talking to me and letting our listeners hear more about um, Negro baseball. And I just want to once again uh, talk about, just once again mention the Invisible Diamond exhibit that you made. I mean, because you were really instrumental in that coming to life, and that you spent 5 years of your life perfecting for the Museum of Texan Cultures. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you on behalf
You're
of
welcome.
our community,
Uh,
and thank you on behalf of SACAM for all of the hard work you've done to bring their stories accurately and passionately to the forefront. And you've been listening to On the Record with Tiffany. And if you want to see the exhibit for the Invisible Diamond, then you can go to my website, otrwithtiffany.com, and you can check it out and enjoy a piece of San Antonio history.